Welcome to our last week. Let's just have an overview of what we covered over the last couple months. So we started with the basic framework. What is access control? What are some of the things we have to look at? And how does it communicate to the business world? So we looked at authentication as a process. We have to make sure we log in, that we check to make sure that's who the user is, authentication factors. We've looked at the process itself. We looked at the business requirements. What is required by the business? This is usually designed up by the top level management, and we're going to look at that. We also discovered classification, the different levels, from the government top secret to the businesses as confidential. And we want to make sure that whoever uses these information understands the classifications and follow them, because they're there for a reason. They usually protect company secrets or government secrets that we don't want the general public to know, because it could hurt our business. Think about if Coca-Cola gave away their signature formula. Well, they would not stay in business too long. So these are the things that companies need to look at. We looked at the human nature. Now, we could have the best access controls in the world, have the highest and latest technology, and it could simply come down to someone making a phone call, calling up an employee and saying, "I'm from IT, I need your login and password," and they give it. So human engineering and human element is extremely vulnerable, and we need to train our employees more. We need to have ongoing training. It's not a one-shot deal. We continually train them. Some of the other things that make sure that we have human nature under control is possibly forced vacations. Maybe they have to take 2 weeks off in a row, especially in the accounting department, where fraud could occur. If they're off for several weeks, things tend to surface. Separations of duties. You don't have multiple people, or you don't have one person making sure everything is done. You have multiple signatures required and some other stuff on that. Also, job rotation is a really good thing. You rotate people through every couple of months. This way they get to know everything about the business, but they can also detect fraud, or it can prevent fraud because they're not at it long enough. But when it comes to employees, the biggest and most important thing we have to do is train them. And that is something we have to look at. Also, ethics. And this comes down from top down. We can look at Enron and WorldCom, Wells Fargo. If the top of the company doesn't have ethics, it's going to filter down and destroy the company and the environment. If you look at what WorldCom and Enron did to the whole economy when they were in Bernie Madoff, these are some of the things that we have to make sure we fight. Assessing risk. As we talked about this entire class, even during, there's risk everywhere. We can't prevent risk. There's risk from getting up and taking a shower. Well, there's risks on everything that we do. If we have a network on the internet, a computer on the internet, it's at risk. We need to protect it. But first, we need to identify that risk. What is that risk, and what is it likely to do to us? We have threats and vulnerabilities. Threat is an outside hacker trying to get into us. A vulnerability is something within our application. Maybe there's a program. That's why we want to make sure we do updates, and we force updates on people, especially when it comes to the Windows world. Windows is constantly finding bugs and backdoors, and we got to get those updates in. So we got to understand that risk happens. We identify it. We make contingency plans, whether it's not building a server down in a server room in Miami where it could be hit by a hurricane, or in Tennessee where it's Hurricane Alley. You want to build your servers where they're safe, avoid risks. If that's where you do business and that's your only location, that's different. But if you're a country, worldwide organization, you want to put it in the best location where it's going to have the least amount of disruptions. Now, if you look at the enterprise, well, if we're dealing with enterprise systems, we have access control lists, access control entries, and we want to make sure that we give the users the least access they need to perform their job. There's no reason for an employee to have manager's access if he's not a manager. If they're a manager, they should have it. But if not, don't give it to them. Give them the least amount of control that they need. This way, if something does happen, if they do get social engineered, they're not going to give away the farm. They can only deal with that little bit that they have. So we want to make sure we use those access lists. Network access control, same thing. Limit who can do. So someone in HR should not be able to look at someone in marketing documents. So we want to make sure we limit that. We want to make sure our wireless LANs are protected. Single sign-on is a great thing to help us do our job, but it comes at a risk that they only have to log in once. In Chapter 1, we talked about multi-factor identification. Well, that's becoming a big thing. As you know, Cumberland just implemented that. There's a reason for that we want to follow that. It makes it more secure. What are the business needs? What are the challenges from a business keeping the business up and running from an IT point of view? Well, we got to have access. We got to have computers. We got to have everything available when they need it. What is it designed? So we're going to look into that a little bit. We covered that. Identify management and access control. What are we looking at as far as what is our management? What do they need access to? What is the size of our staff that we need to be covering? When we do system implementation, we look at the system development life cycle. Multi-layered access control, we wanted to look at that and how did that affect everything that we were looking at. So how do we protect our data? Well, as we learned, encryption is one of the best things, but it comes at a cost. How do we have control lists for our file system? We want to protect our data. We have data in motion, data at rest. So we want to make sure that we know the difference in how to protect it. Data at rest is one of the easiest, sitting on our server or hard drive. Well, if we encrypt it, it's useless to anyone. So these are some of the different things we want to make sure. Are we protecting against executables, workstation servers? So these are some of the things we looked at also. Then we looked at physical security, securing the building. Is it a wide open area? Do we have cameras? Do we have lights? Is it guarded? Do we have guards on site? Security systems. Do we have to use badges to get into the system? Or is anyone allowed to roam without being escorted? So these are some of the big things that we have to look at. We also looked at, does it make sense to have a third party do the building security? In some cases, yes. Especially if we're not, and who's responsible for it? Well, if we're renting a building, it's the building owner who's responsible. If we own the building, it becomes our responsibility, and we have to decide if that's something that we want to invest in, or do we want to have a third party do it. The advantage of a third party is that they are experts at it. The disadvantage, we don't know who they hire. So these are some of the things that we got to keep in mind when we're looking at physical security. And as you know, mobile is a remote worker. It's a huge issue right now. How do we make sure that the person on the other end is who they say they are? Well, one way is authentication factors. They have to use their login and password, and they get a message on their phone. In the past, it was tokens, but now everyone has a smartphone. You're going to see more and more of that. A couple of the schools I work for are implementing that now. VPNs for transmitting data. We have a VPN that we can put in, and that helps prevent anyone from getting our data while it's in motion. So these are some of the things that we want to look at, that we examined in our class. We spent a day on encryption, public key, infrastructure. What is that? What is encryption? Encryption's been around for over 2,000 years. It's not new. It is now harder and harder for this. Cryptology is something that companies are using. Every time you go on a website and it has an HTTPS, it's secure. Well, that tells me it's encrypted, that no one can read that data that's being sent when you hit the send button. Encryption's a nice, easy thing. It uses algorithms, and we have that available to us. We can also use encryption something, a hash, if you remember, we talked about that. And that is allows us to make sure we can use that for digital signatures to make sure the document was unaltered. And that's a big part of what we want, part of the whole digital scene is how do we know they didn't change anything? Well, we run a hash on it before we send it. When we get it back, it is hashed again and it should be identical. So this hashing is a great way, and that's part of the encryption process. And we looked at testing. We have unit testing, integration testing. Testing's a big part of our system. We have the system development life cycle. It's a 7-step waterfall effect, and that helps us when we're doing our programming, implementing any new systems. We follow a system. When we follow a system, we know it's going to be correct. And so we use that. We also have a system for testing security. We might do penetration testing as we're going to get into this. Handling that testing is a big part of it. We do unit testing, make sure what they built works, and we integrate it, make sure it works within our major system. So these are some of the different things. What is assurance? Well, these are the practices, the checks and balances to make sure everything is up to date and everything is working correctly. That we have management and control. Audit trails. The systems generate, most of our systems are automatically generated audit trails. Do we follow them? Do we look at them periodically? So these are the things that we want to look at. We looked at the different laws. Federal government has a bunch of laws that if you're within a specific industry, if you're in healthcare, you better be following HIPAA. If you're in the finance, you're following the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So it depends on the law, what your industry in, but there's laws. It doesn't matter if you can't claim you don't know the law. You're responsible, especially if you're on IT. You're responsible to make sure that you build systems that comply with the law. On top of federal laws, there's state laws we need to comply with also. So you need to understand what your federal and state laws are in order to build your system correctly. Then the last system we looked at was security breaches. They're going to happen. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What kind of controls do we have in place to deter them? There's actually laws in there defining what we have to do if we have a security breach and what we must and what we should do. And we have to follow those laws. It's also part of the laws are we do every effort to make sure that we don't get a security breach, that we protect our customers' data, we protect our systems. If we get a breach, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to inform our customers, our employees? What's our liability to pay them for damages? If it's something, if you look at what's happened with Target and Yahoo, they lost significant business because of their breaches. So keeping the breaches from happening is our first step, what we need to do. Once they occur, well, how long did it go? And then how long did we go before we prevented them from being that? And then when did we identify what happened? So these are some of the different things that we looked at during our class. So I hope you learned something about access control and that how would you implement this in the workplace. I know that was part of your practical evaluation, communication, whatever it was called, practical paper you had to write. But access control gets often overlooked in many aspects of the IT world because it's incorporated in other areas. But it is something that is vital to protect our data, protect our company secrets, our government secrets, protect our employees, and most importantly, it protects our customers. And that is what everything's about. Without customers, it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to stay in business that long. So we have to make sure that we protect our customers' data. And if something does happen, what do we do about telling them and preventing it from happening again? And it could be better firewalls, more training of employees to ensure social engineering doesn't happen. It could be better encryption. We might want to include encryption more in our process. But it comes down to training. Training is probably the key for most businesses. We can spend the money on the hardware and software and prevent out the professional hacker, but the social engineering is something that we have to still work on. That's going to come from training. Thank you.